When I was growing up, my dad and I lived with my grandparents. My parents had me while they were teenagers, and my dad got full custody because he lived with my grandparents, and my mom was just living with random friends, going from house to house every few weeks. I was the daughter my grandparents never had, and they doted me. When I was 6, my grandma passed away from cancer. My grandpa passed away from cancer. This story takes place about 5 months after he passed away. And this was, I believe, a Saturday, and my dad was at work. My grandma decided to take me to McDonald's for lunch, and like any 6-year-old, I was really excited. So we go to the McDonald's that was about 1.5 miles from our house, order our lunch, and sit down at a table to eat. At the time, we were the only ones eating inside. About 10 minutes after we sat down, a scraggly-looking man walks in, orders a meal, and sits down at the table diagonally in front of us to the left. The area we lived in was middle and upper middle class, so this guy looked pretty out of place. Grandma had her back to him, but I could see him perfectly. The man was at least in his mid-50s, was really weird and scraggly and dirty, white hair and beard. He had on blue shorts and a white t-shirt and kind of dirty, and sandals. So, yeah. It's amazing that this happened 21 years ago, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. So I noticed that under the table, this man had something dark pink and wrinkly on his lap, and he kept glancing at me and rubbing it every few seconds. In kindergarten, we learned about stranger danger and good touch, bad touch, and learned which parts of our body people weren't supposed to touch. It clicked in my 6-year-old mind that this man was not supposed to have that out like that, nor doing what he was doing. I got really queasy and nervous. I didn't want to tell my grandma right then and there because I thought the man would hurt us. If my dad hadn't been there, I would have said something because my dad was a hero and could take on anybody. Instead, I put my Happy Meal box in front of my face so my view of this guy would be blocked. I ate about half of my food, but I had lost my appetite. Grandma asked if I was full, and I just nodded yes. I was and still am very petite, so not finishing a full meal was nothing new for me. She asked me if I wanted to go play in the play area before we left, but I shook my head and quietly said I want to go home. Grandma cleared our table and we left. When we got home, I was still really nervous and I felt like I was going to throw up. Grandma asked me, "What's the matter, Munchkin?" Her pet name for me. And I started to cry and I told her about the man at McDonald's and what I saw. My grandma didn't panic or freak out or get hysterical. She just hugged me and said, "It's alright, go on to your room and play and I'll take care of it." She wiped her tears, gave me a blueberry Kool-Aid burst, and told our dog, Patches, to go to my room with me, which she did. After I was out of earshot, Grandma called the McDonald's and told them about the guy. He was still there. The manager told Grandma he'd take care of it and call her back. An hour later, the manager called back and tells Grandma they called the police, who showed up in record time and arrested the guy. When the police told the man to stand up, his franken beans were still hanging out of his shorts. The manager also told Grandma that she could bring me back for a month's worth of coupons for free Happy Meals. I have another story about a weirdo that happened a few years later, and this time my dad was there, and believe me, what my dad did to him was not pretty, but that's a story for another time. So, creepy man with your thing out, let's never, ever meet again. I was living in a low-income housing apartment in Minnesota, and at the time, my mom and I simply couldn't afford to have an actual internet provider. This meant I leached off people in my building who had an unprotected wireless connection. Whenever their internet connections would go out, I would be forced to walk down to McDonald's in order to use the free Wi-Fi there. This had been a pretty common thing for me. One of these internet droughts. On one of these internet droughts, I was standing about in the lobby of my apartment about to leave when the guy who lived next door to me, an older guy named Joe, stops me before I go. He tells me that him and another of my neighbors were going to McDonald's for coffee, and that he'd buy me one if I went along. I figured, why not? I didn't really know much about Joe since I mostly kept to myself. Let me explain Joe. He is hunched back with a beer gut, and his ZZ Top Esquik beer was full of food crumbs that I can only assume were from a McBiscuit. But he seemed like a nice enough guy, so I went along. After a ride in his rickety truck through the Minnesota winter, I was happy to reach McDonald's. Ah, free Wi-Fi at last. And if Joe held up his word, a free McCoffee as well. I sit down and fire up the laptop to soak in all that free Wi-Fi. Soon after Joe comes back with our McCoffees, as soon as he sits down, he starts asking me in a raspy voice, "So, boy, ever heard of God's DNA?" I look up from the windows, slow to screen, and ask, what? I was totally baffled and thinking, great. Stuck with another fucking missionary. Damn it. He goes on to inform me that God's DNA is molecules that hold the universe together, not to mention one makes men genetically superior to women. I sure as shit didn't learn that in physics class, so I blew him off, and when I got the chance, quickly ducked into another booth to browse the internet in peace. He didn't seem to notice, because afterwards a barrage of freaky, bearded lumberjack dudes would come in and out of the McDonald's and talk to him for 15 minutes at a time. I can only assume they were talking about God's DNA because I did my best to not pay any attention, but Joe and his gang of weirdos still gave me a very creeped out feeling. I could tell that they kept looking over to stare at me when they thought I wasn't looking. Having had enough weirdness for the night, I decided to duck out when he hobbled off to the bathroom. I assume only to take an epic McShit. I took my chance, folded up the laptop, and headed out to brave the cold Minnesota winter on the way back home. I reckoned that having to put up with the element was still preferable to being around a bunch of weird-looking lumberjack creeps. I was almost back to the apartment when I heard the truck slowly rolling up and crunching in the snow. I looked over my shoulder and I saw Joe in his truck. Next to him was another one of those fucking bearded bums from McDonald's. I waved to them, but I got no response. Whatever, I thought. I went home for the night after that creepiness. But then after that, every time I went to McDonald's, either Joe or one of his weirdo lumberjack buddies would be there. I could practically feel them leering at me. They always appeared grungy and deceived. Forced to go to McDonald's just to use the internet, I tried avoiding them as much as possible. It almost seemed as if they knew ahead of time that I was going to be there. Considering they all had a relationship with Joe, I think it was very likely that they actually did. Eventually, someone broke into Joe's apartment and stole his bicycle, prompting him to move elsewhere. I learned a couple things about Joe after he left his apartment, such as he traded most of his food stamps every month for drugs, and that he regularly told women in our apartment that he wanted to leave his body and spirit and ravish them in their sleep. Whatever that meant. So Joe and his creepy lumberjack friends, let's not meet ever again.